Next, in terms of the next speakers,
Badini.
okay, we've got two folks from Skanska who are here today to discuss their perspective on public-private partnership, I gather, from the private side. So I think this is a good opportunity. Paul Badini and Chris Gutkelch. Thank you. In any event, I'll let you go in the order that works best for you, and look forward to hearing what you have to offer.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and we'll start off by giving you a little bit of background on Skanska. Both Chris and I represent Skanska. My position with Skanska is I run the civil operations for New England, and as such, I'm the individual. When you saw John's slide, it showed you the progression of the model from DB to DBFOM. I am the continuum. I represent the DB component of the P3 model, and I'll be providing a little bit of insight on what we recommend to be the key best practices for that component. And as Chris gives you some examples of past P3s, I'll chime in on what that means from a DB standpoint. But on the next slide, just give you a little bit of background on Skanska itself.
Next slide.
Yep. There it says one of the world's leading companies in the construction and project development. We are the preeminent P3 practitioner in the United States. We've had significant experience overseas as well. Chris will give you ample examples of that. We're listed as the 8th largest international contractor. We are, in fact, the 3rd largest domestic contractor, both on the building side and civil side, with over 50,000 employees. We have a strong bonding capacity of $10 billion. And we have a very diversified portfolio of work, and our 4 major business units are building construction, vertical construction, heavy civil for transportation, commercial development, and infrastructure development. The first 3 of those bullet points are the business units that we actually have here in the Boston area and in eastern New England. And infrastructure development is our concession entity, and that's Chris's bailiwick, and he will guide you through that and give you some lessons learned and examples of P3s in the U.S. by Skanska. Chris?
Thanks, Paul. So, as Paul was saying, I represent the concessionaire side of the business. There are about 37 of us, actually, in the USA, mostly headquartered in the old town Alexandria in Northern Virginia. We're entirely focused on public sector clients. And we've closed and are delivering 3 of the largest P3 transportation projects in the US. Literally, we've done this in the last 4 years. So, we're very much, eager to continue with sort of success inside the US market. We move on to the challenges and issues. And again, I won't dwell on these because you know them well. But what I would say is that time is running out to fix infrastructure. I know we all say that, but I would make the point that what you don't want to do is to be left behind as other states start to really accelerate their own sort of development programs. And I would emphasize John's point that, yes, it's great to see a good project sort of come out, but actually in terms of the market, the competition is sort of driven by looking at a state and you can see a pipeline of opportunities. So it's, those are important points to remember. Why consider a P3? Can we switch the slide, John? Again, John's provided an excellent overview of the reasons for doing P3. I would emphasize risk transfer and the whole life approach. These projects are, continue from 25 sort of plus years, but the point about it is you're operating and maintaining those assets with a guaranteed sort of performance from the assets throughout the actual sort of project itself. And in terms of benefits to the users, I would only emphasize that it's not just about sort of providing this asset. You know, these projects do actually sort of warp the sort of universe around them in the sense that social, economic, and community benefits actually really come out of these projects, and particularly because of their long-term nature. So what makes for a good P3? I would emphasize Project Champion. It's really important for us, before we get involved in a P3 procurement, it's almost our first question. Who's the project champion? Preferably it's something like the governor, but it's certainly got to be someone who can really drive the project when inevitably it will get into sort of awkward situations, particularly during the procurement phase. We look at the procurement team itself. You know, have they ever done a P3 before? You know, are they going to be employed full-time on the project? Do they have enough capacity to be able to still take this on? And also advisors. Again, we're looking at advisors with a track record of actually advising a project all the way through the procurement process and through to the financial close. It goes without saying, you know, you want a very clear sort of defined scope and objectives before we get involved with this. And from a Skanska point of view, and indeed I think Joe would sort of say the same, the projects, technically complex projects, are actually the right sort of thing to be looking at for going after P3s. You know, lots of blacktop and so on isn't necessarily the best way to employ a P3. And last but not least is, you know, the value of the project being put through the P3 process has to outweigh the cost of sort of transactions. And you know, you'll hear different rules of thumb, but in terms of sort of size of a project and the value to be created from it by doing a P3, you're probably looking at sort of $100 million is a sort of baseline before. Below that, yes, you can do projects below that, but you have to think very carefully about how much you're actually paying to actually do all the due diligence and so on to do that project. So when not to use the P3 model, and again, I think it's been sort of well rehearsed. But you know, if you've got a situation where you've got a project 25 years plus, and it's difficult to know quite what the demand for the services being provided from the sort of the project are, again, you have to sort of think quite carefully about that. And I would only sort of make this point as a developer too, is, you know, these are businesses. We are creating businesses from these projects. It's not just the provision of the actual asset itself and the maintenance of it, but we are providing or delivering businesses which will provide for a very long-term social, you know, benefits, meeting sort of social challenges, and that's our business. Okay, move on to the challenges. Again, I think we've talked a lot about many of these challenges. I would only emphasize education. A good reason why John Parkinson and sort of Lisa here from AI or John from the NCCCP is it's so important to us at the earliest stage to be able to educate not just public officials and so on, but legislators and indeed the general public. And another thing we have to sort of think about is it's not helpful if, in terms of the procurement process, there's a sort of emphasis on sort of short term as opposed to some of this wider strategic thinking that's required for these type of projects. And then last but not least, it's always an issue if you don't watch it carefully, and that is environmental approvals and permitting. You know, it's not a good idea to start a project procurement before you've even sort of really started to do getting the environmental approvals in place. Otherwise, what happens is everything gets pushed out and delayed. So just moving on to a few case studies, and again, I'll ask Paul will sort of help me out here, particularly when we start talking about some of these sort of technical innovation that we're actually bringing to bear on these projects. But first, the Elizabeth River Tunnels, a $2 billion plus project in Hampton Roads in Southern Virginia. Capital requirement on that, $1.4 billion, a 58-year sort of contract. The success of this is that the new Midtown Tunnel has actually been delivered 6 months ahead of schedule. And, the whole project, in terms of congestion busting, has been a sort of raging success. The other things I would mention here is concern is always expressed about what happens when you have a big project like this. Surely it damages the small businesses and the sort of local contractors. They don't get a look in. Well, all of us know that all projects or construction projects are local, in terms of delivery. And I would say out of that 1.4 billion of capex, something like 650 million is actually going to small and disadvantaged and sort of local contractors and suppliers. And the other thing I'd say here too is this is a project which Skanska is very happy and has taken toll risk. So if the traffic doesn't turn up, that's our problem, and it's our job to actually sort of manage that. In terms of lessons learned, community outreach is so critical to any of these projects. You've got to get the public on side. Stakeholder engagement, and do it jointly between the Department of Transportation and indeed the sort of concessionaire. Very, very important process. Not just during the project itself, but before it, long before it, and indeed after that project's been sort of delivered. And then, last but not least, is the importance of relationships. This is all about relationships, and particularly the way in which the concessionaire, the construction sort of joint venture, and the O&M providers and so on, all come together in this sort of partnering arrangement. Soft issues are really important here. So let's move on to LaGuardia. And again, it's nice to see Joe here because he's Meridian's a partner with us on that. But LaGuardia Gateway Partners closed the LaGuardia project back in April, I guess, and that's some sort of $5 billion in terms of its size, of which something like 3.6 billion capital expenditure being required. Skanska actually teamed up with Walsh on that. But what I want to actually bring out here is to let Paul talk a little bit about the sort of just really how important things like BIM is for looking at design innovation and so on.
You want to go to the next slide?
Yeah.
And we're going to, there's a LaGuardia, go ahead. LaGuardia is a textbook example of a very complicated P3 in that we had a very limited work plate. There was the site is very congested, and we had to simultaneously demolish and rebuild the terminals while connecting them to 29 bridges in the Grand Central Parkway. So the only way to manage that kind of complexity is to the use of 4D construction sequence. This is technology that blends the Primavera, the P6 schedule to your actual CAD model, and it's done so in an interactive mode. So when we started modeling this, we broke down the entire site, both the transportation and the building, into discrete pieces that tied up to an activity in the schedule. And when you change your schedule, you automatically change the output, the animation. So it's the only way that we could wrap our arms and our minds around this estimate and accurately estimate the project. But then it's an outstanding tool to monitor progress through the job, both for the contractor and for the owner, to make sure that things are going according to Hoyle. This is technology that we have in our BIM Center of Excellence, which is actually located here in Massachusetts. And we perform this type of study on all projects, all design, build, and large P3 projects around the United States. And this is certainly something that the state of Rhode Island should not only be accepting of, but actually demand. You have to demand this type of, this level of sophistication and this kind of technology in your procurement specifications.
Thank you. And then last but not least, I just want to talk a little bit about the I-4 Ultimate project in Orlando, Florida. Again, this is a widening of 21 miles of the I-4. Just looking at the sort of the amount of sort of construction required, particularly it's 140 bridges and the associated improvements for that, but all within a sort of existing sort of right of way, and so traffic management is a really critical part of these projects. And again, when you're looking at bidders to actually do this, the ability to really be able to deliver traffic management in very dense urban areas is a really critical sort of point. I've emphasised again the point about DBE SWAM, but I'd also like to point out the importance of things like simulators for actually being able to train up the people perhaps who haven't touched heavy construction plant before, but they have the opportunity. If they have the aptitudes to know, particularly any gamers and so on, have the ability to be able to be sort of brought into a workforce like this. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of these projects in terms of what they do to a sort of local community, both in sort of lifting up in terms of sort of direct jobs and indirect jobs, but they really force a sea change in sort of mindsets of people who suddenly realize, wow, I can get myself a really good job. And in our position, this is good investment. Our job is to continue to grow, and it's important for us to be able to know that we actually have workforces and suppliers and subcontractors that we can call on at any time as we continue to our growth. So it's important investment for us. Again, we'd like to share a little bit more on BIM.
Yes. If you want to just click through them slowly, John. This is another use of this technology, and when Chris said that it's important that P3s are clearly defined, it's equally important that there's tremendous flexibility within the design of the job, and in the participants, the bidders, are allowed to progress their designs through alternate technical concepts. We've worked in many jurisdictions, some of which are very prescriptive. They only allow certain ATCs. They may cap it at a certain number, or they may not allow any of them at all. And what the double whammy of that is that you get less innovation, you get less cost savings, and you open yourselves up to harm if those prescriptive specifications don't work. In this kind of an instance, these are what I showed you before in the 4D model were macro views of the project. These are micro views. This is one of the intersections on the I-4 project, and we were able to, and this is a typical example of enunciating exactly what's going to happen in a specific point in time, down to the cones and the traffic signs in the street, explaining how we're going to achieve the installation of the new work, keep traffic flowing. And we use this type of an animation in our original, our one-on-one meetings with the owner, which are really critical during the design build part of the project. The more we can come into the owner, and we've had jurisdictions where we come in and the owner would have legal experts, the traffic people, everybody in the room who are capable collectively of making a decision as to whether part of the design that we're purporting is acceptable. And what that allowed us to do is go back and incorporate those changes into our design. And this can result in, one case, we saved $100 million on an $850 million job. So the benefits to the state are immense, and it creates more innovation, and the more open and the fewer controls that are placed on that innovation process, the cheaper, the less expensive the job will be, and the faster it'll go, and it'll provide the platform for then these brilliant people to come in with the financial part of it to finish up the process. So this, you just click through it, John. But this represents one corner of a 22-mile-long project. So you can imagine we've had people working on this for 2 years and will for surely years to come. But the real crux of this kind of technology is de-risking the project. Everyone here has told you risk is a prime concern. This is how you de-risk it, because you're test driving the project before you get out in the field, minimizing the options for error, and lowering the cost and making it faster. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, John. So I just really want to finish off by reprising some of the sort of lessons learned from Skanska's point of view, from its US P3 experiences. Firstly, absolutely critical to spend time thinking and sort of planning and implementing sort of stakeholder management. And it's not just a question of, the occasional sort of public hearing. That really isn't good enough. It's really important to, have staff out on the ground and so on, really preparing the localities and cities and so on for what is actually going to be happening during the project itself. We say that, and I absolutely believe it, having been here for 10 years, but political risk is the #1 risk for USA P3s. And, of course, there's upside to that too. But, for our point of view is when we're looking at, which project should we be going after, is we're thinking about, well, what happens in the event of regime change? What is that likely to do to the project? And at the bottom of this slide, it may be apocryphal, but some 50% of US P3s have either been cancelled or have been sort of delayed indefinitely, and mostly as a result of sort of changes in political will. Perhaps the wind has sort of changed in terms of, do we or do we not need it? And I would only point out things like Virginia Beach Light Rail, where, having passed a referendum a few years back, there's now been, of course, recent vote, and they've decided not to go forward, with that. And that's the reality of what we have to deal with as developers and contractors. And this stuff is really difficult. It's got fantastic benefits if you get P3s right. But the amount of planning that you have to go through, this is not straightforward Gantt chart, everything moves in a sort of linear format. This has got so many stakeholders involved with it. It is absolutely in the front of the sort of public glare that it's incredibly complex. And you have to have people who are able to sort of deal with that complexity and be able to manage that and be able to deal with the ambiguity and so on, to get around these projects, because the benefits are spectacular if you get it right. If you get it wrong and you just think in terms of a linear format, you're going to fail badly. And last but not least, just to make the point, it is so important to us as developers and contractors to see alternative technical concepts being put out, because it allows us to truly drive a competitive solution to the public need. And last but not least, I just want to move on to the sort of finding the best value. You use the term a lot, and I'm saying it's more than just low cost. It's not all about the low price. It's the impact in terms of, what does this do to communities, economic development? It's all jobs, very, very important thing. But these are jobs which are not just there for the actual project itself. They continue. And more importantly is that people going through this process, having been employed on a project like this, have skill sets which are so easily deployable elsewhere. Anything else? That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Before we move on to the next speakers, any members of the Commission have any questions or comments or anything they'd like to hear a bit more about?
Well, Chris, one of the things you mentioned, political risk, just so to clarify that, maybe Midtown Tunnel is a good example of what happened between regime changes. And maybe if you could just comment on that.
Absolutely. The Midtown Tunnel was a sort of interesting procurement in itself. That Virginia actually has P3 legislation in place which allows for, if you put a project out to competition and only one bidder comes back and says we want to do this, then there is a process that allows you to be able to sign a development agreement with that sole bidder, and then you have a sort of joint process of being able to develop the project together with the Department of Transportation and its advisors. It's a fantastic way of building long-lasting relationships, for these projects. Now, the issue about the Elizabeth River tunnels was that previously, years back, these projects have been tolled. Tolls have then been sort of taken off, and then the idea was, in order to pay for the new infrastructure and refurbish the existing infrastructure, there was a requirement to bring tolls back. And, of course, a lot of people didn't like that. But also, in order to get an affordable toll, something which could be sort of stomached by both the public and sort of local politicians, there was a decision made to actually toll that project even as we started the construction. These are sort of difficult sort of processes and so on. Now, at the time is in Richmond you had a Republican administration and real good hard driving from the governor downwards to make sure this project actually happened. Then, of course, there's a change of regime, and a lot of noise had obviously been sort of generated around the whole business about tolling existing facilities and so on. And I think that, when we look back on it, we could have done a better job both from a public sector point of view, but also from a private sector point of view to manage the stakeholders better. And so, all I'm saying is it's interesting. In fact, if it's the risk that you haven't thought about, is the one, or the stakeholder or that community that you just haven't thought about, is normally the one that actually comes and bites you.
Remember that when your lawyers ask you about risks that you think are peripheral. They're usually traced to something very similar to that. If I could indulge for just
Certainly.
a footnote on that, because in a hypothetical counterfactual world here, much of what was dealing with the Elizabeth River tunnels dealt with tolling. Tolling became the strategy by which there was going to be a revenue stream to fund the infrastructure procurement under a P3. I'm not saying it could have gone another way, but there are other P3s on that spectrum, and there are other financing strategies where the tolling risk goes away. Maybe there may not even be tolling. If there's if in the assessment by that champion and in the close upfront work in the development of the project and the program, there's a, and I would have covered it if I had a little more time, my apologies. The availability payment is a strategy for P3s where you deliver, even if it's a revenue producer, maybe that you reconceive of the tunnel not as a revenue producer, and you look to other revenue sources to avoid this political risk which advances the project. It's those kinds of discussions that happen at the beginning, and it happens when you engage with the developers who say, look, Elizabeth River tunnels, we had a tolling problem. That costs money. That's a risk for us. There's a transaction cost for us. Have we thought about it thinking it this way? So the point is, on my footnote here, is Elizabeth River Tunnels is a great example of political risk, but it's also a really good example of how you think about political risk at the beginning before you assess whether or not to go this way or that way. That's all I want to say.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
In your proposal, you indicate that 50% of all P3s are either canceled or go into indefinite delay. Is that a result of overly aggressive sales tactics, or is there some other reason for that?
I mean, it's more to do with either there may have been a sort of announcement of a program or a sort of proposal, and then thinking about it may be not such a good idea. Maybe the public has moved on. Case in point, the Virginia Beach Light Rail. I mean, public were solidly behind. I think it was sort of 70% vote for light rail to be brought into Virginia Beach, and then a few years later, you know what? I think maybe we don't need this as much. So it's a change of stuff happens as people sort of adopt new ideas. But that's our job as on the private sector side, is we have to figure out what are the projects which are definitely going to make it all the way through and actually sort of deliver a great sort of benefit at the end. And I think we expect it as it's just a necessary part of the process, that these are such big problems that that the public sector has to sort of figure out that sometimes probably the best decision made is to just let that project drift out sort of indefinitely, or actually physically cancel the procurement. But a lot of the time, there's political sort of will behind whether these things happen or not.
Was it because structuring the project is just so complex that by the time you get it done, the political climate's changed?
Not in my opinion. Sometimes, but a lot of the time is people want to roll something out before it hasn't been completely thought through.
Right.
And frankly, the political aspirations of some, this is really good for my district, hasn't worked it out internally. That's the job of the champion that we keep talking about before. If you get that vetted in advance, you diminish that political risk. And I'm glad you said that, Chris, because political risk is, you've confirmed it is the largest impediment in the engagement of the private sector. But in my opinion, as an attorney, it's mitigatable. You can spend a lot, it's not completely, you can't remove it entirely, but you can do a lot of homework. Don't go running off fancy pieces of paper with pictures of fancy bridges until you've sorted out your revenue streams, until you've sorted out the right time to roll the project out, until you know whether or not, if any particular risk that would be reserved to the public sector could actually be covered. Whether or not the people that you are going to be tasking with running this program and into the project actually know how to answer those questions. And I think that goes back to your point where you say when you come in and you're vetting a project, whether or not to engage, you're looking for a champion, political climate, advisors, and the training of the people who are involved. So I think 50% goes sideways, in my opinion, because 50% of the people don't know what they don't know.
I have just one comment to offer. I mean, in my experience in dealing with public projects, my bet is that 50% of most public projects are either deferred, indefinitely delayed, canceled. At least that's my experience. I've been in Rhode Island long enough to see that it happened. Or they'll change form in some way, perhaps come back years later. I mean, I've worked on projects personally that haven't gone from the conceptual stage and the discussion stage to the back burner, back on the front burner for a period of time, and it can be 10 years or more before the project actually gets into the ground and is done either as a conventional procurement or as a public-private partnership type procurement.
And one thing the private sector loves to do is to come in very early indeed in the process and be able to actually engage with the sort of agencies and their advisors and actually bounce ideas.
Exactly.
It's important to us, we can understand where the project is in terms of its life, but we can save a lot of tears later on. And so it really is it's an important part of the process. If we find that an agency is keen to engage, that's a very significant tick in the box for going after a project.
One comment I'd make is that in the beginning, some states they had a change, say, in governor, and they went from pro PPP to kind of anti, and the new guy ran anti and killed a major project. Well, these private companies are spending millions to pursue and invest in doing PPP in that state, and it ruins that state's opportunity to attract interest from the private sector for a long, long time. So, I mean, I think that's a lesson for Rhode Island. If we're going to start this, one of these, we need to finish them, and we need to consider the political risks for political winds that change. But no, thanks.
Yeah, the worst thing can happen, really, in terms of the procurement process, is that you get all the way down to a stage where you've selected a preferred bidder. So a lot of money's been spent to get there, and then suddenly, maybe we should actually refer this to the legislators for a final view, and that makes certainly the private sector very nervous indeed when that happens.
Thank you very much.
If I could?
Anybody else?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You indicated in the discussion so far that there's the 3P concept fits best when there's technical complexity. Is that also saying there's a minimum value, minimum dollar value that needs to be involved to be able to really attract interest from qualified players?
I've got to let Paul actually respond to that. I would say that I threw out 100 million as being a sort of floor that you might want to to think, if it's, schools and things like that can be delivered clearly for much less, but then to get the full benefits of something like that, and some social infrastructure, you would be trying to bundle the schools together into something a bit bigger as a program. But perhaps
I think we need to distinguish between transportation projects and private commercial projects. I know that there's consideration locally for a commercial model where it's more, it's different from the dynamics of transportation.
The other thing is I would add is that, as I think you'll hear implied, if nothing else, is this whole market is literally learning. As it goes along, people are standing on the shoulders of others and so on, just to advance this thing along. So there's some truly innovative thinking which is going on inside the market in terms of being able to bundle risks, in terms of being able to see are the ways in which you can bring commercial real estate thinking into some of the P3s. That's the beauty about P3, and particularly as it stands in the States. As John showed earlier, you've got this continuum of risk, and it's just a question of figuring out where's the right place to actually take that risk. I think I would also say is for those who get worried, and I know that's not the case here, but for those who worry about if P3 is going to take over the world of government procurement, even at its best, where I came from in the UK, I think no more than 10%, if that, of all government procurement was actually done as P3.